You're listening to the Happiest Lives podcast with Jill Lillard, episode 151.
Welcome to the Happiest Lives podcast, where you'll learn to think better, feel better, and become the woman God says you already are. Here's your host, Jill Lillard.
Hey. Welcome back to the Happiest Lives podcast. Today is the final episode in this short series on adult children. Over the past few weeks, we've talked about expectations, the grief that often sits underneath them, and the shift that has to happen as our relationship with our kids moves from parent-child to adult to adult. This last conversation is really about pulling it all together. What does a healthy relationship with your adult children actually look like once they're grown? What does closeness look like when you're no longer responsible for directing their lives? Because a lot of parents feel this transition, but they aren't sure how to navigate it. The instincts that worked when your kids were 10 don't always work when they're 25. And sometimes the habits we developed while raising them stay in place longer than they need to. I was thinking about a couple I worked with that illustrates this really well. The dad had grown up in a very different environment than the one he created for his kids. His parents were pretty negligent. He had to start working at a young age. Nobody was handing him money or creating opportunities for him. If he wanted something, he had to figure out how to earn it. And he did. He became a successful businessman. He developed a strong work ethic. He learned to rely on himself and figure things out. But when he became a father, he made a decision. His kids were not going to grow up the way he did. So he did the opposite. When his kids started driving, he bought them brand new vehicles. While they were in school, he put money in their checking accounts every week so they wouldn't have the pressure of working. He wanted them to focus on school, sports, and activities. He wanted them to have opportunities he never had. From his perspective, he was giving them the childhood he wished he'd had. But over time, something started happening in the relationship. The kids weren't grateful. They expected it. They depended on their parents financially, but they were also disrespectful toward them, critical, dismissive, and entitled. The parents were confused because in their minds, they had done so much for their kids, but the relationship had become tense. The dad eventually said something that stuck with me. He said, "I think we created something we didn't mean to create." As we worked through it together, he began to see something important. His desire to spare his kids from hardship had slowly removed the very things that had shaped him: responsibility, effort, contribution. He had spent years trying to give his children what he didn't have, but the truth was the things he didn't have had actually formed him. He didn't necessarily like the way his parents handled things, but he had to admit those experiences built something strong in him: discipline, drive, and self-reliance. So the parents started making some changes. Not dramatic changes overnight, but steady ones. They began introducing clearer expectations around contribution and responsibility. They stopped stepping in to rescue situations the way they used to. Things didn't change overnight. In fact, it's still a work in progress. But the kids noticed right away that something was different. The parents were calmer, clearer, less reactive. The old pattern had shifted, and the kids weren't quite sure what to make of it yet. The hope is that over time, respect will grow as the kids begin carrying more responsibility for their own lives. Because when adults start contributing and solving problems themselves, something often changes inside of them. But that story raises an important question for parents, especially if your kids are still young. Who are the adults you want your children to become? Not just what you want them to achieve, but who you hope they will be. Responsible, respectful, capable, able to carry the weight of their own lives. And once you start thinking about that, another question naturally follows. Are you doing things for them that they could be learning to do for themselves? Sometimes what feels loving in the moment slowly becomes enabling. Doing for someone what they are capable of learning to do for themselves may feel helpful in the short term, but over time, it can weaken their sense of responsibility and competence. And sometimes there's another layer to it. Sometimes the things we do for our kids are connected to our own childhood. We're trying to give them what we didn't have or protect them from experiences that were painful for us. That instinct makes sense. Most parents want their children to have an easier path than they did. But sometimes the very experiences we're trying to remove are the ones that build strength. And that leads us to a practical question a lot of families are navigating right now. What does it actually look like when your adult child still lives at home? So let's start there. In an earlier episode, we talked about the stage of life often called emerging adulthood, that stretch of years when young adults are stepping into independence, but are still figuring things out. For a lot of families, that stage happens while their child is still living in their home. And that's something I'm thinking about in my own life right now. My daughter is graduating from high school this month, and she'll be living at home while she goes to college, at least for the first couple years. So we're entering that stage where she's clearly moving into adulthood. She's 18. She's making more of her own decisions. Her world is opening up, but she still lives in our home. And that raises some interesting questions for parents, because the structure that made sense when she was 16 doesn't automatically translate now that she's 18. For example, we've always had a household rule that when the kids go to bed, their phones get plugged in downstairs. No phones in the bedroom overnight. That rule made a lot of sense when they were younger. It protected sleep. It prevented late night scrolling. It was simply part of how we ran our home. But now she's 18. So the question becomes, is that still a rule? Or is this one of those places where she begins making that decision herself? Parents run into similar questions around things like curfews. Do you still have one? Or does that change once your child is technically an adult, even though they still live in your home? And underneath those practical questions is the bigger issue most parents are trying to navigate. How do you give your child increased autonomy while still expecting responsibility, especially when they're living under your roof and you may still be paying for things like school or housing? There isn't always one perfect answer, but one framework that can help is this. As autonomy increases, responsibility should increase alongside it. More freedom and more responsibility grow together. So instead of thinking primarily in terms of rules, parents can begin thinking in terms of adult expectations. You're not supervising a child anymore. You're sharing a home with a young adult. That might mean more conversations and fewer rules. You might say something like, you're an adult now, so you'll make your own choices about things like your schedule or your phone. But you're also sharing a home, so we still need to think about respect for the household and for each other. And I'll say this too. The question that comes up at this stage aren't always just about phones or curfews. For some families, the questions are bigger. Things like alcohol, parties, relationships, sleeping arrangements. In our situation, those particular issues aren't things I'm especially worried about with my daughter right now. But for some of you listening, those are the questions you're trying to sort out. And when those topics come up, it can help to step back and ask a slightly different question. What does it mean to be part of this household? Not just what rules do we enforce, but what does it mean to live here, share space here, and contribute here? Because every home has a culture, every home has values, and it's responsible for parents to say, if you're living here, these are the expectations for being part of this household. That might include things like contribution, respect for shared space, consideration for the other people living here, and the alignment with the basic values that shape the home. Not as a way to control an adult child's life, but simply as clarity about the environment you're willing to maintain. Because during this stage, you're holding two realities at the same time. Your child is becoming an adult, and you still get to decide what kind of household you're running. When those expectations are clear, it often makes the relationship easier rather than harder. And eventually, of course, most adult children move into a place of their own. And that's when another shift happens in the relationship. Let's talk about that next. When your children were growing up, closeness was built into the structure of daily life. You saw each other regularly. You knew what was happening in their world. Your lives overlap constantly. But once they leave home, something changes. Closeness becomes voluntary. You can't structure it the same way anymore. You can't require it. Connection happens because both people want it. And one thing I've noticed in this stage is that connection often grows out of simple traditions that develop naturally. After my son got married, something started happening that we never really planned. On Sundays, the kids would usually come to church with us, and afterward, they'd come over to the house. The boys would end up downstairs watching football, sometimes with other friends or family who might stop by. It was just a relaxed kind of day. At some point, someone would fall asleep on the couch. And while the guys were downstairs watching football, it gave Olivia, my daughter, and me time upstairs to sit and talk and enjoy each other. Sometimes the day would end with me making dinner for everyone. None of that was planned ahead of time. It just became a rhythm. During the week, we'd usually invite them over for dinner one evening. Again, nothing formal, no pressure around it. It just seemed like something they enjoyed doing, and I think they appreciated having a home-cooked meal. And if I'm honest, it was kind of nice cooking for more than just a few of us left at the house. Another tradition developed for a season on Friday nights. When they were living nearby, we had a small pickleball group with some close friends. We'd all meet up, play pickleball for a while, and then go grab dinner afterward together. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a simple rhythm we all enjoyed. But it became a really special part of that season of life. Looking back, what made those things work is that they were mutual. They weren't focused. They weren't expected. No one felt obligated. They were simply things we all enjoyed doing together. And I'll be honest, that's something I really miss since they moved away. And I think there's an important lesson in that. If you want connection with your adult children, look for ways to spend time together that feel easy for both of you. Low-pressure rhythms, shared experiences, things that both of you genuinely enjoy. Because the moment guilt or pressure enters the picture, the dynamic changes. When connection becomes something someone feels obligated to do, the fun disappears pretty quickly. But when the connection is mutual, people actually look forward to it. And over time, those simple rhythms can become some of the most meaningful parts of the relationship.
Hey, I just want to let you know my signature class is back. It's called The 4 Things You Must Do to Become the Happiest Wife. And no worries, if you're not married, this can help you with any relationship. I've completely redone it, re-recorded the lessons, and updated the workbook. And it's free. If you've never gone through it or it's been a while, this is a really good time to take a look. If you feel stuck, frustrated, or disappointed in your relationship, then I'll walk you through 4 shifts that can change how you think, how you respond, and how you show up. You can check it out at myhappyvault.com or in the show notes. There's a link. Now let's get back to it.
Another habit that becomes really helpful in this stage is learning to ask before giving advice. When your children were young, guidance was part of your role. But as adults, unsolicited advice can feel like criticism. Sometimes it's as simple as asking, do you want my thoughts on that? Or do you just want me to listen? That small shift communicates respect. And one more thing that becomes important during this stage, if you want friendship with your adult children, you have to stop auditioning for authority. Authority had a place when they were growing up, but friendship grows in a different atmosphere. Curiosity, respect, shared experiences. Because something unexpected often happens if parents navigate this stage well. The relationship with your adult children can become one of the most enjoyable relationships in your life. Not because you're managing them anymore, but because now you're simply relating to another adult you love. There's another part of this stage that doesn't get talked about very often, letting go. When people hear that phrase, they sometimes assume it means becoming distant from their children. That's not really what it means. Letting go is more about releasing certain roles that made sense earlier in parenting, but don't fit the relationship the same way anymore. For a long time, your children needed you for almost everything. You organized their lives, you helped solve their problems, you provided for them. You carried a lot of responsibility for the direction their lives were taking. And then gradually, that changes. They begin solving problems without you. They make their own decisions. They build lives that don't revolve around your household anymore. And that might take some adjustment. For many parents, one of the places this shows up is around money and support. When your kids were young, providing for them is simply part of the job. You buy their clothes, you pay for their meals, you cover vacations. Holidays revolve around them. And then one day, they're adults. But some of those patterns are still there. So parents begin asking questions like, do we still pay for everyone's meal when we go out together? Do Christmas and holidays stay exactly the same as when they were kids? Do we keep covering the family vacation? If you're in a position to help your kids financially, most parents genuinely enjoy doing that. It feels good to be generous with your children. But another question often starts to sit in the background. Am I helping in a way that supports their independence, or am I continuing a pattern that they eventually need to take ownership for themselves? It's not about being stingy. It's not about cutting your kids off. It's about recognizing that adulthood changes the nature of support. Sometimes generosity looks like treating them to dinner. Sometimes it looks like letting them pay for their own way. Sometimes it means helping when there's a need. Sometimes it means stepping back so they can build their own capacity. And most parents are figuring that out in real time because letting go rarely happens in one big moment. It usually happens through 100 small decisions over time. Decisions about when to step in and when to step back. Decisions about what responsibility now belongs to them. Decisions about how the relationship is changing. Another layer of letting go is releasing the sense of control that naturally existed earlier in parenting. When your children were young, you set the rules, you shaped the environment. You had a lot of influence over the direction of their lives. But adulthood changes that dynamic. Your influence becomes more relational than structural. You can still offer wisdom, you can still have a perspective, but you can't steer their lives the same way you once did. And sometimes letting go also means releasing the picture we had in our minds of how our child's life would unfold. Every parent carries some version of that picture. The life we hoped they'd have, the path we imagined they'd follow. And sometimes life turns out a little different. Part of letting go is making space for the reality that their life ultimately belongs to them. None of this means the relationship becomes less meaningful. In many ways, it becomes richer. But it does require a shift from directing their life to respecting their life, from managing them to relating to them, from control to influence. And when parents begin making that shift, something interesting often starts to grow in the relationship. Not just love, but friendship. And that's what we'll talk about next. As I think about this stage of parenting, I realize I had some really good examples. My parents were such a beautiful model of how to raise adult children. Because of that, this stage of life hasn't felt as confusing or heavy as it might for some parents. I watch them walk through it, and in many ways, I feel like I'm stepping into the role they once had in my life. My parents didn't try to hold on to control as we grew up. They didn't try to manage our lives as adults. They stayed interested in us. They enjoyed us. They welcomed us into their lives without pressure or expectations. And over time, something really beautiful developed. My parents became some of our closest friends. Not in a way that erased the parent-child relationship. They were always our parents. But there was something else layered into it: mutual respect, shared life, and genuine enjoyment of each other. We wanted to spend time with them. And as I watch my own kids grow into adulthood, I find myself thinking about that more and more. In many ways, this is the stage where I begin to become what my parents were to me. But I also know not everyone listening is there yet. Some of you may feel distance with your adult children. Some of you may feel tension or conflict. And if that's where you are, it doesn't mean the friendship is finished. It may simply mean the relationship is still transitioning. Moving toward friendship with your adult children begins with a few practical shifts. One is repairing where repair is needed. Parenting's a long journey. None of us do it perfectly. Sometimes there are misunderstandings, hurt feelings, or things that were said or done along the way that need to be acknowledged. And sometimes a simple, sincere apology can open the door to a healthier relationship. Another shift is releasing the role of constant authority. When children become adults, continuing to correct, advise, or manage them can keep the relationship stuck in an earlier stage. Friendship grows when curiosity replaces correction, when listening replaces directing. Another step can be learning to see your child differently. Instead of viewing them primarily as someone you're responsible for, you begin seeing them as an adult with their own thoughts, values, and life experiences. You're getting to know them again. And sometimes cultivating friendship simply means looking for ways to enjoy each other. Low-pressure connection, shared activities, simple time together without an agenda. It might be going to dinner, taking a walk, playing pickleball, watching a game. The point isn't what you do. The point is creating space where the relationship can breathe. And sometimes the biggest shift is simply this: letting your adult children be who they are while still loving them deeply. Because friendship grows in an atmosphere of respect and freedom. And over time, many parents find that this stage becomes one of the most meaningful parts of the entire parenting journey. Not because you're raising your children anymore, but because you get to enjoy the adults they've become. As we finish this series on adult children, I hope one thing has become clear. Parenting doesn't end when your children become adults, but it does change. The role shifts. Earlier in life, you carried a lot of responsibility for the structure of their lives, but adulthood introduces a different kind of relationship, one that requires more space and more respect, and sometimes more patience as both sides learn how to relate to each other in a new way. There may be moments of grief in that transition, grief over roles that have changed, expectations that need to be released, or the realization that your children's lives are now fully their own. But there can also be a lot of beauty in this stage. You get to watch the people you raised step into their own lives. You get to learn who they are as adults. And over time, many parents discover that the relationship begins to include something new: mutual respect, shared life, and genuine enjoyment of each other. Not because you're managing them anymore, but because you're simply relating to another adult you love. And that can become one of the most rewarding parts of the entire parenting journey. If you're walking through this season and you'd like support, you don't have to figure it out all on your own. A lot of women in my community are navigating these same kinds of life transitions. Changes in family relationships, changes in identity, changes in how we show up in the lives of the people we love. If you'd like to process some of these things with other women who are thinking about them too, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I can point you toward some ways to get connected and involved in the community. And that brings us to the end of this series. I hope you've enjoyed these conversations about raising adult children and the transition into this next stage of parenting. Next week, we won't have a new episode. It's the 5th week of the month, and I usually like to release 4 episodes each month. But be sure to join me the week after that because we'll be starting another new series. Until then, thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time on the Happiest Lives podcast.
Quick question. Have you grabbed your free mini course, The 4 Things You Must Do to Become the Happiest Wife? I'd love to give you 4 simple tips plus a free workbook to help you process your relationship and find greater satisfaction. Sign up today at myhappyvault.com and I'll show you how to change your marriage without the exhausting work of trying to control your husband. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who needs encouragement. See you next time.